Now, you guys will no doubt know that I'm a massive fan of all things Marvel, be it comics or movies, and I've been a big fan, of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. I have really been looking forward to Guardians of the Galaxy and had the opportunity to see it yesterday. And wanted to do this review, so sort of full disclosure at the beginning. This will be a spoiler-free review, but I just want to say I did absolutely love this movie. I really enjoyed it from beginning to end, which is something that you're probably used to hearing people say by now because it is having overwhelmingly positive reviews. Start off with the plot. It basically follows the character of Peter Quill, who refers to himself as Star-Lord, played by Chris Pratt, who was, as a young boy in the 80s, abducted and taken into outer space. There he became a sort of roguish thief, a ravager, and through sort of a certain set of circumstances while chasing the movie's MacGuffin, he comes into contact with Gamora, played by Zoe Saldana, who is the adopted daughter of Thanos, the Marvel villain. Rocket Raccoon, who is played by Bradley Cooper, and he is a genetically modified talking raccoon, and also Groot, played by Vin Diesel, who is a sentient tree who can only say 3 words, which are "I am Groot," and Drax the Destroyer, played by Dave Bautista, the ex-WWE wrestler, who is basically a warrior travelling across the galaxy to avenge the murder of his wife and daughter at the hands of Ronan the Accuser, who is really this movie's big bad villain, played by Lee Pace, and his assistant, lent to him by Thanos, another of Thanos' adopted daughters, Nebula, played by Karen Gillan. So there are quite a few familiar faces and names in this, and quite a lot of characters to establish. So that's the basic who's who of the players, and the plot revolves around a MacGuffin, an orb, which you glance in the trailer in a wonderful Indiana Jones riff that Peter Quill has stolen, and everybody wants this orb. The reasons for that are sort of spoiler territory, so I won't go into that, but needless to say, this orb does feed into the familiar sort of setup of the Marvel movies. They're definitely sort of setting up future installments and MacGuffins. So that's pretty much the plot. Now, the plot itself sort of takes a backseat to the characters, really, because the fact of the matter is that James Gunn, the director, this is a guy who did Slither, which I really didn't care for, and Super, which was an amazing movie. He is tasked, within the space of 2 hours, he has to establish all these characters, and not just the characters, but their dynamics and chemistry and backstories and personalities. He has to do that in 2 hours, whereas we've seen this done before with the Avengers, but that benefited from having several movies leading up to it. So the plot really does take a backseat to the establishment of the characters, which is fine because it's the first time we're meeting them. So that's, the most important thing is to get those guys established. What I will say is that going in, I was a little bit worried about a couple of things, one of which is Bradley Cooper voicing Rocket Raccoon, because I just thought, as much as I like Bradley Cooper, does he have a really distinctive enough voice or sort of personality that would shine through voice work? And I was a little bit unsure, but I'm eating my words on this one. Bradley Cooper as Rocket is probably the standout of the movie. He's absolutely fantastic, and he brings so much to Rocket Raccoon. There is a certain sense of sarcasm and wit to everything he says, and just sort of cynicism as well. His dialogue cuts through the movie like a knife through butter, and I really enjoyed the character of Rocket. As well, you have Rocket really paired up with Groot, played by Vin Diesel. Vin Diesel, only has 3 words to say throughout the entire film, technically 4, but all he can say is, "I am Groot," and they could have really gotten anybody to do that role, but to be honest, Vin Diesel really does bring a certain element to it. And I'm not saying that the guy is a fantastic actor, I can't imagine he's ever going to win any Oscars, but this is a guy whose background is sort of in voice work. He was the voice of the Iron Giant back in the 90s, which actually had the same sound editor as this movie. So he's done voice work before, and you can definitely feel a certain element of his sort of acting chops coming through, and he makes Groot a lot more than just a CGI character that spouts 3 words. And the dynamic and chemistry between Rocket and Groot is very sort of touching, especially towards the end. I find myself sort of tearing up a little bit at what happens to those characters. So that has to be a testament to the 2 actors playing the roles, as well as the guys who were wearing the motion capture suits as well. Those were great. Zoe Saldana is her usual reliable arse-kicking self, although Gamora's probably... the thing is, they set her up as, you know, she's the sort of kidnapped/adopted daughter of Thanos, and there is a lot of fertile ground there to explore her character and her backstory. They sort of hint at it, but they didn't really get to flesh that out, but that's because they had to establish all of the characters in this movie. So there's a lot of sort of groundwork there for Gamora's character to go to some interesting places in future installments, but I do think they gave us enough in this movie to make us care about all of the characters. So I don't feel like any of them got short shrift, but she definitely has a lot of potential. Dave Bautista, this is another thing that I was a little bit unsure about going in, was Dave Bautista's casting, because to be honest, I've never seen the guy in anything, and only had a sort of passing knowledge of him as a wrestler. Because I used to be really into WWE back when it was WWF and stuff, but so I didn't really know Dave Bautista. I just thought, casting a pro wrestler as Drax, you know, I thought it was just because of his size, but I'm eating my words on this one as well. Dave Bautista is absolutely brilliant as Drax. He has great comic timing, and I was discussing this with my partner when we got back from the theatre yesterday, and that's probably due in no short part to the fact that wrestling, especially the big sort of budget WWE stuff, is essentially soap opera. So it's not like he hasn't acted before, but he has great comic timing and delivers some of the best lines in the movie. A lot of Drax's dialogue got big laughs in the film. You know, there weren't many people in the theatre, to be honest with you, but the people who were there were laughing throughout, and Drax got some of the biggest laughs. So Dave Bautista was really good. Chris Pratt. Now, Chris Pratt is an actor that I will have no shame in admitting that I have a man crush on Chris Pratt. I absolutely love him. I love him in Parks and Recreation. I loved him as the voice of Emmett in the Lego Movie, which is still one of my favourite movies of the year. He's fantastic, and I like the fact that he committed to the character, that he shed so much weight, because he used to be quite chubby and, you know, got ripped for this movie, and it shows a certain amount of dedication. He has a certain charm and charisma and presence. He's very much cut from the same cloth as your sort of mid-80s Harrison Ford or Nathan Fillion in Firefly. You know, he's definitely of that same ilk, you know, the wisecracking hero who's lovable and likeable, but a bit of a dick underneath. So he was great. He managed to pretty much carry the movie in as much as he was in most scenes in the film. And it is very much, you know, he's very much the star, so to speak. And between this and Jurassic World that's coming out next year, he's going to become a household name. So, you know, look out for Chris Pratt doing more in future. He was great in this. They did make a couple of odd choices with the character, in as much as sort of making him a womanizer, which I think teeters on the edge of him becoming unlikable. It just stays on the sort of side of good taste, but in lesser hands, because this was written and directed by James Gunn, as I mentioned earlier, in lesser hands I think he could have sort of teetered and fallen off the unlikable cliff, but between James Gunn and Chris Pratt, they managed to make the character somewhat lovable. So I really enjoyed his character. The villains, Ronan the Accuser, played by Lee Pace, and Nebula, played by Karen Gillan. Now, they suffer from the sort of same fate as a lot of Marvel villains, in that they're not given a lot of screen time, and again, that'll be because they had to establish the Guardians. But Ronan, I feel like we could have maybe done with 1 or 2 more scenes explaining why he's doing what he's doing and his motivations, just a little bit, give us a little bit more. You know, I think the best villains, like Loki in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, you have to be able to relate to the villain as well, and you have to sort of understand where the villain's coming from and empathise with them to a certain extent, and that to me makes a villain frightening, and they didn't really have time to do that with Ronan. And Nebula is potentially a very interesting villain. the sort of quasi surrogate sibling of Gamora, and I think again there's a lot of fertile ground to explore that in the sequel, which I hope they do, because there is a distinct lack of interesting female characters in the Marvel universe. You know, it'd be nice to have a female lead at some point. Come on, Marvel, the world is crying out for it. But a lot of the female characters in there, you know, aren't given much to do. I mean, you've got Black Widow's obviously the exception, and Gamora's pretty good, and it just feels like we need more of that fleshed out. So that's something I hope they explore in sequels. The film itself looks beautiful. It's gorgeously shot. A lot of the shots are just awesome, and it's very colourful and bright and pulpy. It feels like a living comic book. It is shot on digital, so now and again in the darker scenes it wobbles slightly, and people who know my channel will know that I'm not a big fan of digital photography in cinema, and every now and again it can look a little bit cheap, but for the most part the film's gorgeous looking. The soundtrack is awesome. The soundtrack they use as a plot device. Basically, when Peter Quill was abducted as a child in the 80s, he had a mixtape with him, so the soundtrack of the movie is that mixtape, and you've got a lot of sort of pop songs from the 70s and 80s. Each one is used to great effect. I found myself sort of listening to the lyrics and sort of how it fit the scene and stuff, and it works really well. I will no doubt be picking up the soundtrack at some point. I absolutely loved it. You could tell that people in the cinema were just getting really into it, you know, like heads were going and stuff as the songs were playing, so I think that was a really good call. I mean, to be honest, Marvel films up until now, apart from like your AC/DC stuff in the Iron Man movies, they've largely been indistinguishable scores, but to have a sort of a soundtrack like that, the sort of Tarantino-esque mixtape, it was a really good call, and it does sort of set this film apart in that respect. The effects are great as well. The third act, it does become your sort of what Marvel's known for now, the big action scene where something's either floating or falling, and it was a bit like, you know, I hope that in the future movies they don't repeat that. You know, not that it's wearing thin with me, but I could understand criticisms levelled at this movie where it's the third act is basically the third act that we've seen since the Avengers, and I can sort of understand that criticism. So the third act, albeit the setup and the actual set piece itself was somewhat formulaic in terms of the other Marvel movies, each character is given their own moment to shine, and this is something that applies to the whole film. The action is punctuated with great character beats and genuinely heartfelt emotion between the characters. And it makes you care, so that when the action is happening, you actually give a shit who makes it through it. And this is something that I feel a lot of modern blockbusters don't do, is make you love and like the characters. So that was really good. Apart from the scene itself, the setup being a little bit formulaic, there are nice little touches, nice little moments which I won't ruin, but I do feel like Guardians has set up a lot of groundwork for the cosmic sort of side of the Marvel universe. There are lots of characters and organisations introduced that you think will, you know, no doubt pop up in future movies, and considering it's not a sequel to any of the other films, it does lay a lot of groundwork, and it does so successfully. You do have a couple of moments where you can feel the franchise sort of bearing down on it. There's a moment of exposition where Benicio del Toro's character basically explains the MacGuffins halfway through the movie, and it does feel a bit like the movie sort of stops for him to explain it and say, right, you know, this is what's been happening so far and this is where we're going. And you know, they had to put that in, and I do wonder if it's the inclusion of scenes like that are the reason that Edgar Wright left Ant-Man, you know, the franchise building sort of stuff. But it doesn't derail the film, but it is quite a little bit distracting in a way. But I guess you have to have that in there because, yes, it's not a sequel and it is a standalone movie, but it is part of this wider franchise, so you need that stuff. And no doubt that stuff will become forgivable once you see the further movies and stuff. Marvel's in a really unique situation in as much as their films do work as standalone movies by and large, but they do have to lay groundwork, some exposition, and sow seeds for the franchise as a whole, and that's something that we have to learn to accept and forgive. You know, if we want the cinematic universe to expand as it is doing, we have to accept that. And like I say, it doesn't derail the film, but you do notice it. I noticed it, so there is that. But by and large, you know, Guardians of the Galaxy, it is a fantastic film. It's very much a throwback to sort of 70s and 80s science fiction. A lot of the sets look practical, a lot of the effects look practical. There's a lot of CGI, don't get me wrong, but a lot of it does feel quite lived in and real and tangible. It very much feels like the original Star Wars trilogy in terms of sort of feel and tone. It's probably got a bit more of a dry, knowing wit and a bit of a nudge, nudge, wink, wink sensibility to it. But for people like me, you know, I grew up on the original Star Wars trilogy and then was crushingly disappointed by the prequels. If that applies to you, you will probably love this movie as much as I did, because it definitely feels like a throwback to that era of sci-fi. And to be honest, I mean, between this and Star Wars Episode 7 that's coming out next year, we're going to be spoilt for decent sci-fi. So I'd say this film does work as a standalone movie, so if you're not that into the Marvel Cinematic Universe, you could go see this and enjoy it, you know, don't get me wrong. Apart from a couple of scenes tying in the franchise stuff, it is largely standalone, and I think it would work for people who, you know, don't know the franchise. It's fun, it's a good time. I don't know how well it's going to do. I think it made 11.2 million on its opening night, so it's set to do quite well for the opening weekend. I am surprised sort of people's reactions to it. I know where I work in an office, and people were saying, oh, I don't know how I feel about it, Talking Raccoon and stuff. If you're on the fence, go and see it, because it's thoroughly entertaining. It's a great fun Friday night movie, and you will get something out of it. It's just a good old-fashioned, pulpy, colourful summer blockbuster with lovable characters, just a good story of good versus evil. So I would recommend it wholeheartedly, and it is one of the stronger Marvel films so far. I'm not prepared to sort of put it in a rank. I don't really feel comfortable doing that until I've seen, you know, these movies more than once and sort of rewatched them. It is definitely one of the better ones, though. For me, you know, it's in the top tier of, like, your sort of Iron Man 3 and the Avengers and Captain America the Winter Soldier, but I couldn't sort of rank those without sort of rewatching the latter two. So I love this movie and would thoroughly recommend it to established fans or newcomers. It's a great, good time at the cinema.